Ilan?
4 po sa YouTube.
Sa Facebook.
Sa Facebook po, loading pa po eh. Pero live na po. Sa Facebook ma'am, may 5 na rin po.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another live streaming of Basic Transfer Pricing Philippines. And today, I will discuss to you the OECD Transfer Pricing Guidelines for multinational enterprises and tax administrations, because this is the basis of the transfer pricing guidelines in the Philippines. This is dated July of 2017. The OECD Transfer Pricing Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises and Tax Administration 2017. This is published by OECD Paris, no? Okay, so in these guidelines, we will discuss about the arm's length principles. Oh, mahaba ito, kaya this is a series of live streaming. No, we have the arm's length principle. We will also discuss the selection of the transfer pricing method, the traditional transactions and transactional profit methods, no? The comparability analysis, how it is being done, no? Then the administrative approaches to avoiding and resolving transfer pricing disputes, no? And documentation, no? The documentation requirements under the OECD Transfer Pricing Guideline, spatial consideration for intangibles, we will discuss that also, and spatial considerations for intra-group services. The cost contribution arrangements, the transfer pricing aspect of business restructuring, the arm's length compensation for the restructuring, remuneration of post-restructuring controlled transactions. Then the annexes, no? The sensitivity of gross and net profit indicators, we will discuss that one. The guidelines for monitoring procedures, we will discuss also the application of the residual profit split method, the illustration of different measures of profits when applying a transactional profit split method, the example of working capital adjustments, the sample memoranda of understanding for competent authorities to establish a bilateral safe harbors, guidelines for conducting advanced pricing arrangements under the mutual agreement procedures, the transfer pricing documentation master file, the sample, the transfer pricing documentation local file with the samples also, and the country by country report. Then country by country reporting implementation package. Then example to illustrate the guidance on intangibles, example to illustrate guidance on cost contribution arrangement. Okay. So this evening we will start with first topic, which is the arm's length principle. Okay, so we start with our discussion on the arm's length principle. Okay. Okay, so since this is the first topic, the discussion would revolve around the arm's length principle, which is the international transfer pricing standard that OECD member countries have agreed should be used for tax purposes by the multinational enterprise groups and the tax administration. So the arm's length principle, since as I told you, this is the basis. OECD transfer pricing guidelines is the basis of the Philippine transfer pricing guidelines, which is Revenue Regulations 2013. But since the 2013 was made prior to the 2017 guidelines, it uses the 2010 transfer pricing guidelines as the basis. No? And there are changes or updates in the guidelines on the 2017, just like the documentation. No? Documentation requirements, the 3/3 documentation requirement cannot be found on the 2010 transfer pricing guidelines, but only in 2017 transfer pricing guidelines. No? So the arm's length standards reaffirms the status of the international standard and set forth guidelines for its application. So how these guidelines, arm's length principle, are adopted or can be used in the related party transactions. No? Okay, so when independent enterprises transact with each other, the conditions of their commercial and financial relations. So what are the two conditions that have to be monitored or evaluated in the related parties? Their commercial and financial transactions. Why? Because it involves their operations. No? So the price of the goods transferred or the services provided and the conditions of the transfer or provisions. Why? Because it is very necessary in making a comparability analysis, which is the heart of transfer pricing. Why heart of transfer pricing? Because transfer pricing adopted the arm's length principle, and the arm's length principle provides that the transactions between related parties should be at par or similar to that of the independent transactions, because the independent transaction is the true transaction. So therefore, we have to apply the arm's length principle. So how can this arm's length principle be applied? By doing comparability, by making comparability, compare the related party and the independent party in their financial and commercial relations. How they price their goods and services between the related parties. So when associated enterprises or the related parties transact with each other, their commercial and financial relations may not be directly affected by external market forces in the same way, although associated enterprises often seek to replicate the dynamics of market forces in their transaction with each other. So tax administration should not automatically assume that associated enterprises have sought to manipulate their profits. Of course, it has to be proven. That's why the tax authority should conduct their investigations. There may be a genuine difficulty in accurately determining a market price in the absence of market forces or when adopting a particular commercial strategy. Why? Because the way business are done by the related parties are totally different from the independent parties. So in real life situations, it's very different. Because there are some factors present in the related parties in their financial and commercial transactions that are different from that of the independent transactions. So it is important to bear in mind that I need to make adjustment to approximate, So to approximate arm's length conditions arises irrespective of any contractual obligation undertaken by the parties to pay a particular price or of any intention of the parties to minimize tax. So irrespective of any contractual obligations na undertaken by these related parties. A tax adjustment under the arm's length principle would not affect the underlying contractual obligation for non-tax. So the contractual obligation is different from that of the transfer pricing adjustment if ever done by the tax authority. So for non-tax purposes between the associated enterprises, and may be appropriate even when there is no intent to minimize or avoid tax. That's why in making a transfer pricing analysis, it doesn't it is not a connotation or it doesn't mean, the tax authority does not mean that you are doing some mispricing of your goods, But transfer pricing is a tool for the tax authorities to audit, to see to it that you are complying with the arm's length principle. It does not mean per se that you are doing some manipulations in prices, The company are not pricing its goods correctly. So the consideration of transfer pricing should not be confused with the consideration of problems of tax fraud or tax avoidance. It's different. Even though transfer pricing policies may be used for such purposes, the policies or the method in transfer pricing can be used for tax fraud or tax avoidance activity by the tax authority, but of course, it is different from the transfer pricing. Because transfer pricing should be a regular conduct of the taxpayer at saka regular conduct also of the tax authority. So when transfer pricing does not reflect market forces and the arm's length principle, the tax liabilities of the associated enterprises and the tax revenue of the host countries could be distorted. No? Ilan na?
Sa Facebook po may 10 viewers. Tapos sa YouTube po 11.
Okay, so I would like to shout out, no, this point. Shout out po sa mga viewers po natin sa Facebook at saka sa YouTube. Good evening po sa inyong lahat, no? Pasensya na kayo, please bear with me because this is a very technical topic, no? And I don't want to deviate from the wordings itself of the regulations, no? Kasi ang daming nagrereklamo, ma'am, binabasa mo lang naman because I don't want to deviate from the words of the law itself, no? Kaya yung mga, meron tayong samples, meron tayong mga explanations na gagawin just to give light on the wordings of the guidelines. This is a guideline, no? 2017 OECD Transfer Pricing Guidelines. No? So, OECD member countries, pag may tanong po kayo sa Facebook or sa YouTube, please write on the comment para po masagot natin kung ano man yung inyong mga tanong, no? Even if it is not necessarily related to these guidelines, all about taxes, sasagutin po natin, no? Yung inyong mga katanungan. Okay. OECD member countries. Ano po ba yung OECD? The OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, no? And it is housed in Paris, France. No? It is a non-stock, non-profit corporation, and it has the Center for Tax Policy and Administration of the World. No? Sila yung gumagawa. Right now, yung project ng OECD is how to cope up with the situation of the pandemic and to help the taxpayer in their difficulties of the situation. No? They are making measures to help to cope up with the new situation, just like the taxpayer employees are now working at home. No? So how do you consider that, especially if the home of the employee is a different country from the home of from the office, no? So how can it be treated? The income will belong to whom and to whom the taxes should be paid. No? Factors other than tax considerations may distort the condition of commercial and financial relations, no, established between associated enterprises. So for example, enterprises may be subject to conflicting governmental pressures. No? Kasi the government has some regulations that should be complied by the taxpayer. No? So in the domestic as well as foreign country, depending on where the taxpayer or the enterprise has its operation. So relating to customs valuation, the anti-dumping duties, the exchange or price controls. No? So those are difficulties encountered by the enterprises. So in addition, transfer price distortion may be caused by the cash flow. That can be another cause. The cash flow requirements of enterprises within an NME, no, group, within the group. An M&A group that is publicly held may feel pressure, no, from shareholders to show high profitability at the parent company level. Why? Because this company has investors, and investors are looking forward to have profit, to have a return of their investment. Okay, so parent level, particularly if shareholder reporting is not undertaken on a consolidated basis. No? That's why for the group, they are making consolidated reports in order that it will show the operation as a whole, the result of the operation. So all of these factors may affect transfer prices and the amount of profits accruing to associated enterprises within the M&A group. No? So whose profit should be, no? Especially if the profit is, the operation is highly integrated, so that the problem will crop up that between the members of the group, only one member is showing an income, all the rest are having a loss. Why? Because they either are not making any sales, they are not making any income. No? They are just providing services to the member of the group who has the income. So the problem will lie how to allocate this income. Okay, so it should not be assumed that the conditions established in the commercial and financial relations between associated enterprises will invariably deviate from what the open market would demand. As I told you, there are inherent facts or conditions between the related parties that cannot be found in the independent parties, or situation in the independent parties that cannot be found in related parties. That's why if you want to compare, it is not 100%. Why? Why? Because in the independent party, so many people do the decision making. In the related party, only few people do the decision making. So it's not hard for them to carry a new proposition, to carry a new project, no? Unlike the independent parties. Associated enterprises in M&Es sometimes have a considerable amount of autonomy and can often bargain with each other as though they were independent enterprises. No? So they can also act like they are independent. Enterprises respond to economic situations arising from market conditions. No? So, of course, because the entity is an economic entity, and the economic entity is affected by the economic conditions, just like what happened now. We have the pandemic, no? So we have a different economic conditions, and the enterprises should respond to what is the current situation or the economic conditions in order to thrive in the market, in order to exist as an economic entity or as a business entity. Associated enterprises in M&Es sometimes have a considerable amount of autonomy and can often bargain with each other as though they were independent enterprises. There are situations wherein the parent company give authority to their subsidiaries or to the members of the group, but most often, there are situations that they are not given authority. All the policies coming from the parent company or the head office. Enterprises respond to economic situations arising from market conditions. Their relations with both third parties and associated enterprises. These related parties or the enterprises, they have to respond to both, because they are not making business or doing business with just the related parties. They are also doing business with the independent parties. That's why they have to adjust or to manage both transactions between related parties and between independent parties. That's why in doing a transfer pricing analysis, it's easy for the transfer pricing analyst if both customers, independent and related party customers, are present, because that will form part as the comparable, the internal and the external comparable. So the analyst will not uh, have any hardship to find comparables, because there is internal comparable that can be used in doing transfer pricing analysis. Local managers may be interested in establishing good profit records and therefore would not want to establish prices that would reduce the profits of their own companies. No? So, in order to make profit, you have to monitor your prices. No? Because in pricing goods and services, there lies your profit. That's why proper costing is a must, no, in business. Tax administration shall keep these considerations in mind to facilitate efficient allocation of their resources in selecting and conducting transfer pricing examinations. Okay. It may occur that the relationship between the associated enterprises may influence the outcome of the bargaining, because there is a relationship, and that relationship has a point, or has something to do with the bargaining. No? Evidence of hard bargaining alone is not sufficient to establish that the transactions are at arm's length. No? So what do the tax authority or the analyst is interested in? If the transaction are arm's length, because of this application of the arm's length principle. That's why we have to always go back to the question: is it arm's length? Is the transaction arm's length? No? If the financial and commercial transactions is between related parties, is it arm's length? No? And the problem lies on what is arm's length. No? Because if you want to discover what is an arm's length transaction, then you must compare. No? And in making comparability analysis, the information, the available data is very important, because if there are no data or information available, then it's hard or difficult for the analyst to make a transfer pricing analysis and to prove that the transaction is arm's length. What is the statement of this arm's length principle? This is under Article 9 of the OECD Model Tax Convention. So what is the OECD Model Tax Convention on Income and Capital? That is the guidelines on how to treat the income between countries, and also the basis also of our tax treaties. No? So the authoritative statement of the arm's length principle is found in paragraph 1 of Article 9 of the OECD Model Tax Convention. And this Model Tax Convention is a product of deliberation and work of the OECD in order to come up with a better policies on how to resolve issues in the treatment or in taxing the income and capital belonging to different persons or citizens of different countries. The OECD Model Tax Convention, which forms the basis of bilateral tax treaties involving OECD member countries and an increasing number of non-member countries. So the Philippines is a non-member country, but we adhere to this arm's length principle as internationally agreed principle, accepted principle in determining the arm's length price, or in dealing with the related transactions for tax purposes. No? So what is the authoritative statement of this Article 9, no, for the arm's length principle? It says here, where conditions are made or imposed between the two associated enterprises in their commercial or financial relations which differ from those, naiiba siya, which would be made between independent prices, no? So yung ginawa ng related party, iba kaysa ginagawa ng independent parties, no? So anong gagawin? Then any profits, yung kita, which would, but for those conditions have accrued to one of the enterprises, no? Napunta doon sa isang enterprise, but by reason of those conditions have not so accrued, may be included in the profits of that enterprise and taxed accordingly. Because sabi nga natin dito, parties, no, related parties, group of parties. Yung income ng isa napunta doon sa isa, no, na isang party, have not so accrued to the entity. So anong pwedeng gawin? May be included, i-add back mo siya doon sa profit ng isang entity and taxed accordingly, no? Mas complicated pa siya if yung isang entity na yan belongs to the other country and the other entity na nandoon sa kanya yung income belongs to other entity. That's why ang mga sabi dito na mga against transfer pricing is there is double taxation. Why? Kasi yung profit na na-declare na nung isang country, kasi post-audit tayo, when we do transfer pricing audit, post-audit tayo. So kung yung profit na include na doon sa profit ng isang enterprise and then kukunin mo pa during the transfer pricing audit because you make adjustment, ibabalik mo siya ngayon dito sa profit ng isang enterprise and taxed accordingly, subject mo na naman sa tax. So there is double taxation, no? Can this double taxation avoided? Sometimes it cannot, especially if in some cases it is deliberate in the part of one enterprise to include the profit of the other enterprise is sa isang enterprise na may lower yung tax rate, no? So intentional talaga na hindi dinideclare doon yung income, dinideclare doon sa ibang enterprise because that other enterprise is situated in a country where the tax rate is low, no? Anong purpose? To minimize the payment of taxes. So by seeking to adjust profits by reference to the conditions which would have obtained between independent enterprises in comparable transactions and comparable circumstances, no? Kaya nga, since sabi natin, in transfer pricing, the application of the arm's length principle, we have to compare related parties with the independent parties. So ano yung i-compare natin? Comparable transactions and comparable circumstances. Why? Because if the circumstances and the transactions are not comparable, then they cannot be compared. Or you continue with your comparison, but you make some adjustment to make them comparable, especially if there are material differences and the two transactions are not comparable. So you make adjustment to make them comparable. No? That's the aim, or that's the purpose of the arm's length principle. Okay? May question, ano? At saka shout out tayo. May question?
Wala pong question, ma'am.
Kasi shout out tayo, sino yung mga nandyan?
Si Ma'am Irish Nario.
Okay, so shout out to Miss Iris Nario. Good evening.
Tapos, hello daw din po, sabi ni Ma'am Ann Ruby Ferrer.
Okay, so good evening, Miss Ann Ruby Ferrer. Good evening.
Ako. Tsaka po si Lord Ski Ballesteros.
Okay, so Lord Ski Ballesteros, good evening din, no?
Sila lang po yung nag-comment sa akin.
Okay. So kung may mga questions tayo or ano, alam nyo, I really do some effort on transfer pricing kasi parang ang hirap niya intindihin and yung iba, ay wag na kasi hindi applicable sa atin yan. No? Applicable po sa atin. Kaya sayang po yung transfer pricing, no? That's why we have to make some effort to convince people talaga to study transfer pricing kasi malaking tulong po sa atin, especially sa tax authorities. Especially now that our government is also having difficulties because of the pandemic. So, itong transfer pricing nakakatulong po, no? Sa ibang mga bansa, they are making already so much collection because of transfer pricing, no? So magagamit din po natin in somewhat nakakatulong, no? So what happened to the ABS-CBN yung investigation of the Senate, no? It is only then that transfer pricing has been given due course by the BIR. Why? Because it is the Congress that said you have transfer pricing issues, no? And yet when you try to ask the BIR, wala, tama yung binabayad ng ABS-CBN, wala silang tax liabilities, no? Because the principle of transfer pricing was not applied, no? So ang daming transfer pricing issues. Sana nakakatulong, but we have to move forward or looking forward. So, pabayaan na natin yung tapos na. So, aral tayo ngayon para application for the next situation or transactions naman, no? Kasi yung nagdaan na, tapos na yun. So, po, yung mga nagsasabi na hindi kailangan, wala, hindi applicable yung transfer pricing sa atin, no? You think otherwise. Kasi napaka-importante po ng transfer pricing. If other countries have done so much because of transfer pricing, then we can do it also. Sana tayo. Okay? So, by seeking to adjust profits, no, by reference to the conditions which would have obtained between independent enterprises in comparable transactions and comparable circumstances. So, dalawa yun, ha? So, in comparable uncontrolled transactions, the arm's length principle follows the approach of treating the members of an M&A group as operating as a separate entities rather than as inseparable part of a single unified business. So, there it is the difficulties. Why? Transfer pricing treat the members of the group as separate entities, when in truth and in fact, they are not. Why they are not separate entities? Because they are managed by the same group. And if you try to look it as a person, same face lang po yan sila. And in all their dealings, they are really related parties. Why? The approval of the policies, the financing, are all streaming in one body, no? So how can you compare that with the independent transactions which have a different operation with that of the related parties? But only for tax purposes that they should be treated as separate entities. Why? In order to pinpoint or to give taxes to whom it is due. Why? Because if we try to look the group as one, then the tax that should be paid by the other entities in the country where they are geographically located, then it will be paid only in the place where the head office or where the group wanted it to be paid, no? So how about the other countries where other entities are located? So they will be deprived of their share of the taxes that should be paid to them. Okay. So because the separate entity approach treats the members of an M&A group as if they were independent entities, as if only. Why? Because in truth and in fact they are not independent. Attention is focused on the nature of the transactions between those members and on whether the conditions thereof differ from the conditions that would be obtained in comparable and controlled transactions, no? Such an analysis of the control and uncontrolled transactions, which is referred to as the comparability analysis, is at the heart of the application of the arm's length principle, no? So, talaga niya ang comparability analysis because you have to compare. And in comparing, you have to adjust, no? Because after comparability analysis, then whatever information that you derive from the comparability analysis, then the next thing that you are going to do is you have to adjust, no? Comparability adjustment, no? So, guidance on the comparability analysis is found in section D and in chapter 3, no? Yung sa comparability analysis. And sa annexes, pag-aralan din natin yung mga examples doon on comparability, no? On the working capital. Okay. So it is important to put the issue of comparability into perspective. Yes, because that is the essence of the study of transfer pricing. In order to emphasize the need for an approach that is balanced in terms of, on the one hand, its reliability, and on the other, the burden it creates for taxpayer and tax administrations. No? So paragraph 1 of Article 9 of the OECD Model Tax Convention is the foundation for comparability analysis because it introduces the need for, no? Ano yung needs? Why is it that the arm's length principle should be adopted, no? The need for a comparison. So you have to compare between conditions, including prices, but not only prices, of course. Kasi we have 5 comparability factors that we have to consider in making a comparability analysis. No? So made or imposed between associated enterprises and those which would be made between independent enterprises. No? So in order to determine whether a rewriting of the accounts for the purposes of calculating tax liabilities of associated enterprises is authorized, no? Kasi, di ba sabi niya, the profits belonging to the other parties should be added and taxed accordingly, no? So, determination of the profits which would have accrued at arm's length in order to determine the quantum of any rewriting of the accounts, no? So, when can you find the calculation ng tax liabilities of associated enterprises on the paragraph 2 of the commentary on Article 9, no? So, you can see in the OECD Model Tax Convention on Income and Capital, no, the provision in its article is very, very short, but what is coverage, no, yung coverage ng commentary is very, very long, no, because it has a lot of explanations on one article only. It begins with the history of the article and the changes, and then how come that it is now in its current statement, no? Kaya so many commentaries. Also, napakahaba ng commentaries in its article of the OECD Model Tax Convention, no? So maiksi lang ang mga provisions, yung commentaries ang mahaba, no? So the determination of the profits which would have accrued at arm's length in order to determine the quantum of any rewriting of accounts, no? Kaya bakit mo i-rewrite yung accounts? Siyempre, you have to adjust, no? Kasi if binigay mo na yung profit na yun sa isang enterprise, magbawas ka doon sa isang enterprise kasi doon na nanggagaling, no? Okay. There are several reasons why OECD member countries and other countries have adopted the arm's length principle, no? So, and what are the reasons, no? A major reason is that the arm's length principle provides broad parity of tax treatment for members of M&E groups and independent enterprise. Broad parity, no? At par with the other members, make them the same, no? So, broad parity of tax treatment for members of M&E groups and independent enterprises, no? They are treated the same. Because the arm's length principle puts associated and independent enterprises on a more equal footing for tax purposes, no? So, pareho lang sila when it comes to taxation. It avoids the creation of tax advantages or disadvantages that would otherwise distort the relative competitive positions of either type of entity, no? Kasi payment of taxes sometimes give also competitive position to a company Because you can just imagine a company paying a regular income tax as compared to the company paying a preferential tax rate, no? Or not paying taxes anymore, no? So there is a huge difference between those entities paying taxes regularly under normal condition, normal rate, with those of taxpayers paying only preferential rate or nothing at all, no? So it gives them a competitive advantage over the other entities who are paying their taxes. So in so removing these tax considerations from economic decisions, the arm's length principle promotes the growth of international trade and investment, no? So promote the international trade and investment because of this arm's length principle. Why? Because you put the enterprises same treatment, no advantage or disadvantages over the other for tax purposes, no? Broad parity of tax treatment between enterprises and between the related parties. So the arm's length principle has also been found to work effectively in the vast majority of cases. No? Example, many cases involving the purchase and sale of commodities and the lending of money where an arm's length price may readily be found in a comparable transaction. So, undertaken by comparable independent enterprises under comparable circumstances. So even in the business itself, no, in how to do the business, since we said na dapat arm's length, so meron ding advantage when you apply it in the operations or in the business, day-to-day business, no? Kasi yung price hindi na masyado magkakalayo, no? There are also many cases where a relevant comparison of transactions can be made at the level of financial indicators such as markup on cost, gross margin, or net profit indicators. Nevertheless, there are some significant cases in which the arm's length principle is difficult and complicated to apply, of course. For example, M&A groups dealing in integrated production, yun ang sinasabi ko na the operations are highly integrated, no? At marami yan, no? Of highly specialized goods, unique intangibles, and in the provision of specialized services, no? So mahirap yung separate entity approach. Solutions exist to deal with such difficult cases, including the use of the transactional profit split method. That's why the recommendation pagka highly integrated should be profit split. Why? Because you cannot find amount or income that should be earned by an entity, no? So mahirap yung separate entity approach. So ano na lang ginagawa? Profit split, the splitting of profit, no? And ano naman yung mahirap doon? The finding of variables in which you allocate the profit, no? For as a basis of dividing the profit between the participants. So, guidelines in those situations where it is the most appropriate method in the circumstances of the case. So, the arm's length principle is viewed by some as inherently flawed, no? So, ito yung mga against the transfer pricing, no? Yung mga favor naman, those are transfer pricing advocates. Yung iba naman ayaw. Why? Kasi makikita nila yung difficulties at saka yung hindi applicable yung arm's length principle, no? So the arm's length principle is viewed by some as inherently flawed because the separate entity approach may not always account for the economies of scale and interrelation of diverse activities created by integrated businesses, no? Why does businesses integrate themselves? Because of some advantages na hindi makikita, hindi ma-avail ng independent entities. And then ngayon gusto mo i-treat mo sila the same, similarly, when in truth and in fact, they are different. No? So yun yung magiging parang handicap ng separate entity approach. Why? Because you just treat them as separate entity when in truth and in fact, they are not. No? Para bang i-treat mo siya na maganda pero yung totoo naman talaga, pangit siya. No? Parang it's against the truth. Pero, yun yung another disadvantages. But, mas marami yung advantages. No? But there are, however, no widely accepted objective criteria for allocating between associated enterprises the economies of scale or benefits of integration resulting from group membership. Yun lang yung konting disadvantage, pero mas maraming advantages ang arm's length principle or yung separate entity approach. Why? Because separate entity approach are used only for tax purposes. For other purpose, hindi na. No? Kaya nga, you can do all the business, your business the way you want it. Pero for tax purposes, you are treated differently as a tax entity. No? So there are, however, no widely accepted objective criteria for allocating between associated enterprises the economies. Pinag-aralan na kasi yan eh. And it is only the arm's length principle that is widely accepted. No? Meron tayong tinatawag na global formulary apportionment, yung may certain criteria na group of companies to allocate their income. Pero hindi pa rin acceptable. Why? Because of the uniqueness or the circumstances of every transactions na hindi siya talaga pwedeng ang global formulary. There are so many factors that will affect na hindi kakayanin ng global formulary apportionment. So it is only the arm's length principle na effective. Okay. So no widely objective criteria for allocating between associated enterprises the economies of scale or benefits of integration resulting from group membership. Member ka lang sa group is already an intangible. You are only a member of the group, sikat ka na. Parang may competitive advantage ka na over doon sa iba na hindi member of the group. No? So the issue of possible alternatives to the arm's length principle is discussed in section C. No? Practical difficulty in applying the arm's length principle is that associated enterprises may engage in transactions that independent enterprises would not undertake. Yes, of course. Why? Kasi related sila eh. There is such an element of control na parang kaya mo to because you are a group na hindi kakayanin if you are not working as a group. No? Kaya pagka working in a group ka, maraming support. Unlike na independent ka, wala magsusuporta sa'yo. No? Okay. Such transactions may not necessarily be motivated by tax avoidance, no? So, hindi lang naman tax avoidance daw ang motivation, although it is one, no? But may occur because in transacting business with each other, members of an M&A group face different commercial circumstances. Ano yung different commercial circumstances? Iba-ibang situations, no? Na ma-experience nila while doing business. And para sa akin, yung mga most parang ibang klase ng tao are in business. Why? Kasi sila yung matatalino, sila yung malakas ang loob, no? Because if wala kang mga ganong traits, you will not go into business. Why? Because business is very risky. No? And if you are not intelligent and you cannot handle situation, then you're out of business. No? Such transactions may not necessarily be motivated by tax avoidance, but may occur because in transacting business with each other, members of an M&A group face different commercial circumstances than would independent enterprises. So where independent enterprises seldom undertake transactions of the type entered into by associated enterprises, the arm's length principle is difficult to apply. Why? Kasi walang comparables. there is little or no direct evidence of what condition would have been established by independent enterprises. Kasi, sino lang yung nandun? Only related parties, no? So, walang independent enterprise. So, hindi mo ma-compare kung anong gagawin ng independent enterprises if they are engaging in the same business activity. Wala kang point of comparison. So the mere fact that a transaction may not be found between independent entities does not of itself mean that it is not arm's length. No? Siyempre, you have to make some other sort of analysis, no? Para makita mo that arm's length pa rin, even if very unique yung activity. So in certain cases, the arm's length principle may result in an administrative burden for both the taxpayer and the tax administrations of evaluating significant numbers and types of cross-border transactions. No? So although associated enterprises normally establish the conditions for a transaction at the time it is undertaken, at some point the enterprises may be required to demonstrate that these are consistent with the arm's length principle. No? So, you can see that in the discussion of timing and compliance issues. No? So, the tax administration may also have to engage in this verification process, perhaps some years after the transactions have taken place. No? So, just like how the tax authorities in the Philippines conduct its audit after it's a post-audit, no? After the transaction was completed, no? Post-audit. The tax administration would review any supporting documentation prepared by the taxpayer to show that its transactions are consistent with the arm's length principle, and may also need to gather information about comparable, uncontrolled transactions, the market conditions at the time the transactions took place, and others. For numerous and varied transactions, such undertaking usually becomes more difficult with the passage of time. Why? Because the passage of time will create a different situation than that of previously under where the entity has been operating. No? So both tax administration and taxpayers often have difficulty in obtaining adequate information to apply the arm's length principle, because the arm's length principle usually requires taxpayers and tax administrations to evaluate uncontrolled transactions and the business activities of independent enterprises. So we have to compare, no? So if the situations are already different, then it's hard, no? I'm doing some transfer pricing analysis, and it's hard to document changes, especially the economic conditions, no? Because you are doing a post-analysis, a post-study, and the conditions are different during the time that the transactions took place, no? Kita pa ako, Hari? Okay. Sige. Because the arm's length principle usually requires taxpayer and tax administrations to evaluate uncontrolled transactions and the business activities of independent enterprise, and to compare this with the transactions and activities of associated enterprises, then it can demand a substantial amount of data. Transfer pricing analysis really requires a lot of data and information before you can have comparability analysis, no? So that's why there are many accountants or people in the tax authority that do not want transfer pricing because according to them it's difficult, no? But sometimes the usefulness of a thing lies on the difficulties, no, that it creates. Why? Because just like risk, when you engage in high-risk activities, it requires high rewards. No? So if the thing is difficult, then this is more useful because it's difficult to achieve. No? The glory of it when you conquer or hurdle a difficult thing. No? So the information that is accessible may be incomplete and difficult to interpret. No? Kasi sometimes you have to interpret information. It is not per se the information itself. You have to analyze the data, the facts, interpret, no? And there are the, data who are unquantifiable, no? Qualitative. So how are you going to apply that in your analysis? The information that is accessible may be incomplete. No? Sometimes it's lacking, so you cannot use it because it is not complete to give you the whole picture or the whole idea about the situation. So incomplete and difficult to interpret. No? So other information, if it exists, may be difficult to obtain for reasons of its geographical location or that of the parties from whom it may have to be acquired, especially if it is confidential information and the party who is keeping it is not cooperative, will not give you that secret information. So there lies the difficulties. In addition, it may not be possible to obtain information from independent enterprises because of confidentiality concerns, no? Confidentiality of information. In other cases, information about an independent enterprise which could be relevant may simply not exist. No? So wala talagang information. Or there may be no comparable independent enterprises if that industry has reached a high level of vertical integration. So napaka-unique talaga niya. So wala siyang comparable na independent enterprises. No? It is important not to lose sight of the objective to find a reasonable estimate of an arm's length outcome based on reliable information. So in that case, continue. Do not stop. No? If you are doing some analysis, it's just because there is no available information, then you will stop. No, just continue. No? It should also be recalled at this point that transfer pricing is not an exact science, but does require the exercise of judgment on the part of both the tax administration and taxpayer. No? One of my mentor in transfer pricing told me that there is always transfer pricing because if there are no comparables, you can always hypothesize. In hypothesizing, what are you going to do? Ask question. If this situation, if this circumstance, if these transactions happen between independent prices, are the terms and conditions of these transactions acceptable to independent parties? Because if not, then it's not arm's length. Maintaining the arm's length principle as the international consensus. No? Kaya nga sabi ko, this is a generally accepted principle. No? And the Philippines also accepted or practice also this kind of principle, no? Applies this kind of principle. No? Because we have Section 50, which is our transfer pricing law. And what is that? Section 50 of our National Internal Revenue Code, it gives authority to the commissioner to perform three things, no? Allocate, appropriate, apportion, allocate, apportion, and distribute income and expenses if he sees to it that it is important, no, for the computation of tax to avoid, no, tax evasion. So pwede niya ibalik yung expenses and income. No? Sometimes, anong ginagawa? Undeclared income and then overstated ang deductions. So what happened? No more income. No? So no more tax to be paid. So in that case, the commissioner under Section 50 is allowed to allocate, apportion, distribute income and expenses, no? To avoid evasion of taxes.
May nag-comment po.
Okay.
Si Attorney Pabs Carpio.
How? Teacher ko yan sa law.
Sabi niya, ma'am, nice Elsa, I'm proud of you. Proud likewise to be one of your
Teacher.
professors.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Sir Pabs. Thank you for your greetings. Thank you talaga. Teacher ko yan sa negotiable instrument, no, sa law. No, he's an attorney at saka church member din po. So thank you po, Attorney Pabs. Thank you talaga. Okay. So teacher ko siya sa New Era College of Law po. Okay. So the arm's length principle is sound in theory since it provides the closest approximation, no, of the workings of the open market in cases where property such as goods, other types of tangible assets, or intangible assets is transferred or services are rendered between associated enterprises. No? So while it may not always be straightforward, no, to apply in practice, it does generally produce approximate levels of income between members of M&E groups acceptable to tax administration. This reflects the economic realities of the controlled taxpayers, particular facts and circumstances, and adapt as a benchmark the normal operation of the market. No? So the market is very complicated. No? Adding to that, the economic conditions. That's why we always go back to the 5 comparability factors that guided us, no, in making the arm's length analysis, because those 5 comparability factors are very helpful, no, in making a comparability analysis. A move away from the arm's length principle would abandon sound theoretical basis described above and threaten the international consensus. Why? Because the arm's length principle has been accepted internationally as the principle for pricing transactions between related enterprises. One of the handicap or one of the problem is that increasing the risk of double taxation. Why? Because when you tax the income of one entity, it has been taxed already in that other entity, then it will result to double taxation. But sometimes double taxation cannot be avoided, no? Especially if the shifting of income is intentional. So much as possible, double taxation should be avoided or minimized, but sometimes it cannot be avoided, no? Especially in cases na intentional shifting of income to deprive the other country or the other party of the income that should be paid wherever the entity is situated. No? Experience under the arm's length principle has become sufficiently broad and sophisticated. No? Broad and sophisticated to establish. That's why yung iba, word pala na transfer pricing, ayaw na. No? Kung sinabi mo palang arm's length principle, ayaw na intindihin. Why? Kasi, no, sabi dito, even the OECD will tell us, it is sufficiently broad and sophisticated to establish, no, a substantial body of common understanding among the business community. Especially if there is denial, especially some examiner would say, no, it is not applicable to us. Sayang, para sa akin, it's an opportunity to have this transfer pricing, to have this arm's length principle. So sayang po talaga. This shared understanding is of great practical value in achieving the objectives of securing the appropriate tax base in its jurisdiction and avoiding double taxation. Much as possible, we have to avoid double taxation. That's why we have tax treaties. And the purpose of tax treaties is to avoid double taxation. But in transfer pricing, there are times that double taxation cannot be avoided. No? The experience should be drawn on to elaborate the arm's length principle further, to refine its operation and to improve its administration by providing clearer guidance to taxpayers and more timely examinations. In some, OECD member countries continue to support strongly the arm's length principle. No? Who are these OECD member countries? There are more than 60 member countries now. They include US, Japan, Australia, Canada, no? the highly industrial countries. They are member countries. And they are supporting the arm's length principle. In fact, no legitimate or realistic alternative to the arm's length principle has emerged. Wala eh. There are people who are against arm's length principle, but they cannot also give or recommend a good way to tax these related parties. No? Global formulary apportionment, sometimes mentioned as possible alternative, would not be acceptable in theory, implementation, or practice, no? Because may hardship nga, no? It's difficult to implement the global formulary apportionment, which is the pre-agreed percentage, no, of sharing the income, no, and taxing it where the branch or permanent establishment of an entity is situated. No? It is pre-agreed. No? What is this arm's length, a non-arm's length approach, which is the global formulary apportionment? No? Global formulary apportionment has sometimes been suggested as an alternative to the arm's length principle as a means of determining the proper level of profits across national taxing jurisdictions. Why across national taxing jurisdiction? Because of the advent of globalization. No? Kailan yan nangyari? Mga 1960s pa. No? So there is globalization so that doing business worldwide has been practiced, or it opens the market to everybody in the world. No? So, pwede na mag-business kahit saan. And it carries with it that the goods and services cross the border. No? Nandoon sila sa iba't ibang bansa. So that the complicity of taxing them comes in. So, papaano mo ngayon itatax? This is only through the adoption or application of the arm's length principle. No? So, the approach has not been applied as between countries, although it has been attempted by some local taxing jurisdictions. Kasi mas madali eh, kung global formulary apportionment, pre-agreed na. So, halimbawa, the group of companies has presence in different parts of the world. So, sabi nila, oh, sa Asia, ito yung share mo. Sa America, 20% ka. Sa Europe, 30% ka. It's pre-agreed. No? So, it's easy for the local taxing authority, but difficult to apply, or it's not practical to apply considering the facts and circumstances and the contributions of the entity, no, on the whole business. So global formulary apportionment would allocate the global profits of an M&E group on a consolidated basis. Parang siguro similar siya sa profit split, no? Kasi consolidate mo yung profits and then i-allocate mo, split mo yung profits, no? So, global profits of an M&A group on a consolidated basis among the associated enterprises in different countries on the basis of a predetermined and mechanistic formula. So there is already a mechanistic formula, no? Pre-agreed. So there would be three essential components to applying global formulary apportionment. Determining the unit to be taxed, so sino yung itatax. Of course, it's the entity who is doing the business, no? Which of the subsidiaries and branches of an M&A group should comprise the global taxable entity, no? So that's the other problem. Sino yung mga entities na isasama mo doon sa group, no? Accurately determining the global profits, no? So paano mo i-determine yung global profits, especially if all the entities are also generating their own income locally, no? So establishing the formula to be used to allocate the global profits of the unit. So that's another difficulty. Paano mo allocate, gawin yung formula, no? So it would be likely based on some combination of cost, assets, payroll, and sales. So wala talagang fixed na variables, no, or bases. Global formulary apportionment should not be confused with the transactional profit method. Yung transactional, yung profit split na. So global formulary apportionment would use a formula that is predetermined for all taxpayers to allocate profits, whereas transactional profit methods compare on a case-by-case basis. Kasi yung transactional profit methods, may arm's length principle yun eh, no? Yung compare the transactions, financial and commercial transactions between related parties and that of the independent parties. No? So, may arm's length principle yun. Samantalang yung global formulary, wala kang criteria, no? Kung ano yung gamitin mo na basis in dividing the profits, no? Global formulary apportionment also should not be confused with the selected application of formula developed by both tax administration in cooperation with a specific taxpayer or M&A group after careful analysis of the particular facts and circumstances, such as might be used in a mutual agreement procedure. No, kasi yung MAP, mutual agreement procedure, yan yung can be used in the dispute resolution when the parties or countries and the taxpayer won't agree on the division of profits or allocation of profits, no? Advanced pricing agreement or other bilateral or multilateral determination, no? So iba yun kaysa global formulary. Such a formula is derived from the particular facts and circumstances of the taxpayer and thus avoids the globally predetermined and mechanistic nature. Mechanistic ang global formulary apportionment. Why? Because it does not see into the facts and circumstances how these entities conduct their business or the circumstances of their business, no? Hindi kino-consider ng global formulary apportionment, no? Okay, so comparison with the arm's length principle. So yung global formulary apportionment compared with arm's length principle, no? Global formulary apportionment has been promoted as an alternative to the arm's length principle by advocates who claim that it would provide greater administrative convenience and certainty for taxpayers. Why certainty for taxpayers? Kasi naka-mechanized na siya. Pag sinabi mo na ito, 10% ang mabayaran mo, yung share mo dito, yung i-declare mo na income, then be it. Wala nang marami pang consideration. So, there is certainty, no? But in taxation, there is no certainty in taxation, no? Even our policy makers can prove that there is really no certainty because it depends on the facts and circumstances. These advocates also take the position that global formulary apportionment is more in keeping with economic reality. No? So, ano ba yung economic reality? There are so many factors that affect the price, the supplies of the product. No? So, they argue that an M&A group must be considered on a group-wide or consolidated basis to reflect the business realities of the relationships among the associated enterprises in the group. They assert that the separate accounting method is inappropriate for highly integrated groups because it is difficult to determine what contribution each associated enterprise makes to the overall profit of the M&A group. And these are very crucial for the apportionment of profit. No? You have to see to it the contributions, the participation of the member of the group in order that proper profit can be allocated to that particular entity. So apart from these arguments, advocates contend that global formulary apportionment reduces compliance costs for taxpayers. Yes, of course, because it is easy to, and it is pre-agreed. No? Since, in principle, only one set of accounts would be prepared for the group for domestic tax purposes. The global formulary apportionment is very simple. No? OECD member countries do not accept these propositions and do not consider global formulary apportionment a realistic alternative to the arm's length principle for some reasons. No? Okay. The most significant concern with global formulary apportionment is the difficulty of implementing the system in a manner that both protects against double taxation and ensures single taxation. Yung single taxation, minsan mo lang bayaran yung tax pertaining to your income. No? Kasi transfer pricing deals only with income tax. No? So, sa double taxation naman, there are instances na dalawang beses kang mabayad for the same income. To achieve this would require substantial international coordination and consensus, no, on the predetermined formula to be used and on the composition of the group in question. So for example, to avoid double taxation, there would have to be common agreement to adopt the approach in the first instance, followed by agreement on the measurement of the global tax base of the M&A group, on the use of a common accounting system, on the factors that should be used to apportion the tax. Kaya nga pre-agreed na siya, no? Among different jurisdictions, including non-member countries, and on how to measure and weight those factors. Oh. There are so many factors. Unlike the arm's length principle, meron siyang 5 comparability factors. Sa global formulary apportionment, wala. No? So reaching such agreement would be time-consuming, just like transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is also time-consuming. That's why, pag may nagpagawa sa akin na transfer pricing analysis, less time ko to complete is 60 days. Minsan, hindi pa siya natatapos. No? I have to ask for an extension. Why? Because of the availability of information or data. No? Dati, napakabilis lang manghingi ng documents sa SEC, you can access it online, ngayon hindi na. No? Why? Because of the Data Privacy Act. Hindi na lahat basta-basta nakakakuha ng information. At ngayon, may bayad na sa SEC, no? Per financial statements na kukunin mo. Okay. It is far from clear that countries would be willing to ensure willing to agree to a universal formula, no? So wala kasing universal formula eh. It should be treated unique, no? So even if some countries were willing to accept global formulary apportionment, there would be disagreement. Why? Because each country may want to emphasize or include different factors, no, in the formula based on the activities or factors that predominate in its jurisdiction, no? So magkakaroon pa rin ng dispute in the formula, no, in the share, halimbawa, ng tax that should be paid in one jurisdiction, especially the local or the domestic, no? Kasi they will see ano ba itong actual operation ng business dito sa place na to, and then they're just given a little share doon sa profit, no? So may mga dispute yung local jurisdiction when it comes to that pre-agreed formula. Each country would have a strong incentive, no, to devise formula. Kaya magrereklamo na naman sila na dapat ito yung share ko, dapat ito yung share ko, no? So devise formula or formula weights that would maximize the country on revenue. Why? Kasi bawat isang country gusto nila malaki yung kanilang share, no? So diyan magkakaroon ng problema sa global formulary apportionment. In addition, tax administrations would have to consider jointly how to address the potential for artificially shifting the production factors used in the formula, no? The sales capital to low tax countries. This could be tax avoidance to the extent that the components of the relevant formula can be manipulated. Yun na naman, no? So hindi masyado na cure yung problema on manipulation or tax avoidance by entering into unnecessary financial transactions, no? Kasi kung pre-agreed dyan, may mga politics na napapasok dyan, eh, no? So by the deliberate location of mobile assets, by requiring that particular companies within an M&A group maintain inventory levels in excess of what normally would be encountered in an uncontrolled company of that time. So maraming mga issues and face yung global formulary apportionment. Unlike sa arm's length principle na kompleto na siya, may comparability factors na. With the application or on the analysis of the comparability factors, applying it to the comparability analysis, pag-iiba na yung mukha ng transaction sa bawat entity. So more or less makikita mo na doon yung share talaga ng company based on their functions, based on their assets, based on the risk, no? So nakahimay-himay na yung mga variable or consideration na bago ka mag-compare, no? So mas specific talaga ang arm's length principle. The transition to a global formulary apportionment system, therefore, would present enormous political, yan na yung sabi ko, na papasok na yung politika, and administrative complexity, and require a level of international cooperation that is unrealistic to expect in the field of international taxation. Mahirap magkaroon ng international cooperation, no? Because both countries have different concerns over taxation. Such multilateral coordination would require the inclusion of all major countries where M&E operate, no? If all the major countries fail to agree to move to global formulary apportionment, M&Es would be faced with the burden of complying the two totally different systems. In other words, for the same set of transactions, they would be forced to calculate the profits accruing to their members under two completely different standards. Such a result would create the potential for double taxation or under taxation in every case, no? Shout out, Hari. Walang shoutout.
Wala po.
Ilan pa sila?
Pero may viewer ma'am sa YouTube po, 11. Dito po sa Facebook, 9.
Okay. So, continue lang tayo ha. Still have 15 minutes. Actually, para sa akin talagang nag-i-enjoy kasi ako sa transfer pricing, no? So, pasensya na doon sa iba na talagang ayaw, no? Kasi makulit ako eh. I want to share knowledge in transfer pricing. Why? Kasi para sa akin, sayang na hindi natin ginagamit and ina-apply yung transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is the work of minds, no? Yung talagang pinag-iisipan bago nila na develop itong arm's length principle. So there are other significant concerns in addition to the double taxation issues. One such concern is that predetermined formula are arbitrary and disregard market conditions. So, arbitrary, parang pinwersa mo lang na ginawa. And then, hindi din kinonsider yung market conditions. Because geographically, may iba-iba ang economic conditions, no? Iba-iba ang market conditions. So, it is not being considered sa global formulary apportionment, no? The particular circumstances of the individual enterprises and management own allocation of resources, thus producing an allocation of profits that may bear no sound relationship to the specific facts surrounding the transaction, no? So more specifically, a formula based on a combination of cost, assets, payroll, and sales implicitly imputes a fixed rate of profit per currency unit or dollar, euro, or yen of its component to every member of the group and in every tax jurisdiction, regardless of differences in functions, assets, risk, and efficiencies. Kasi sa arm's length principle, talagang nandoon yung comparability factors na functions, assets, risk. Sa global formulary apportionment are not considered. And among members of the M&A group, such an approach could potentially assign profits to an entity that would incur losses if it were an independent enterprise, no? Kasi iba-iba ang condition pagka independent enterprises, no? So another issue for global formulary apportionment is dealing with exchange rate movements. Ano yung exchange rate movements? Yung sa currency, di ba? Although exchange rate movements can complicate application of the arm's length principle, they do not have the same impact as for global formulary apportionment, no? Kaya tingnan mo yung mga Japanese companies, even if they are located here in the Philippines, kumuha sila ng permit sa SEC to use the their financial statements to be in a yen, no? A currency presented in yen, hindi sa peso, no? And na-prove naman sila ng SEC. The arm's length principle is better equipped to deal with the economic consequences of exchange rate movements, because it requires the analysis of the specific facts and circumstances of the taxpayer. If the formula relies on cost, the result of applying a global formulary apportionment would be that as a particular currency strengthens in one country, no? So consistently against another currency in which an associated enterprise keeps its accounts, no? So a greater share of the profit would be attributed to the enterprise in the first country to reflect the cost of its payroll nominally increased by the currency fluctuation. So magkaiba ang effect sa bawat country, no? Especially iba-iba yung currencies. Thus, under global formulary apportionment, the exchange rate movement in this example would lead to increasing the profits of the associated enterprise operating with a stronger currency, whereas in the long run, a strengthening currency makes exports less competitive and leads to a downward pressure on profits, no? Kasi sa currency, affected yung paano mo i-recognize or i-compute yung profits, no? Kaya nga yung sabi ko sa inyo, yung mga locals dito na mga Japanese companies, may permit sila na report yung kanilang financial statements in yen, no? Siguro later on, follow din yan by the Koreans kasi ang dami din mga Koreans dito sa Pilipinas. Ang gagawin naman yan to report their financial statements in the Korean currency, no? And followed also by others. Although sila, yung presence ng mga companies dito sa Pilipinas, napakarami. Number 1 talaga in Japan, yung mga Japanese companies, no? Pero ngayon, dumadami na rin yung mga Koreans. So, contrary to the assertion of its advocates, global formulary apportionment may in fact present intolerable compliance costs and data requirements, no? Because information would have to be gathered about the entire M&E group and presented in its jurisdiction on the basis of the currency, no? And the book and tax accounting rules of that particular jurisdiction, no? Kasi kagaya sa Pilipinas, meron din tayo sarili nating mga bookkeeping rules and regulations. Not so much on accounting because we already adopted the international financial reporting standards. So, meron tayong accounting standards na normally international. No? So, not so much on accounting. The documentation and compliance requirements for an application of global formulary apportionment would generally be more burdensome than under the separate entity approach of the arm's length principle, no? So the cost of a global formulary apportionment would be further magnified if not all countries could agree on the components of the formula or on the way the components are measured, no? So yun ang mahirap, yung mag-agree sila sa isang formula, no? Or i-adapt nila yung pre-agreed formula na. So, mahirap. Difficulties also would arise in determining the sales of its member, no? And in the valuation of assets. So, how about those entity na walang sales, no? Kasi nga, just doing service to the group. So, historic cost versus market value, especially in the valuation of intangibles. So, that's another difficulty, yung valuation ng intangibles, no? These difficulties would be compounded by the existence across taxing jurisdictions of different accounting standards and of multiple currencies. So, ito yung mga constraints, no? Accounting standards among all countries would have to be conformed in order to arrive at a meaningful measure of profit for the entire M&E group. Of course, some of these difficulties, for example, the valuation of assets and intangibles also exist under the arm's length principle. Pareho lang, no, na may mga problema, both global formulary and the arm's length, no? Although significant progress in respect of the latter has been made, mas lamang na yung arm's length principle. Kasi may mga kagaya dito sa transfer pricing guidelines na to, meron na tayong mga guidelines about intangibles, no? Whereas no credible solutions have been put forward under global formulary apportionment, no? Sa arm's length, may mga solution na. Sa global formulary apportionment, wala, no? So, global formulary apportionment would have the effect of taxing an M&E group on a consolidated basis, no? Consolidated basis, not separate entity approach, and therefore abandons the separate entity approach, no? May iiwan na yung separate entity approach used by the arm's length or ito yung preferred ng mga local taxing authority the separate entity approach, so that it can be determined how much really profit, how much tax will be paid in a particular entity. No? So as a consequence, global formulary apportionment cannot, as a practical matter, recognize important geographical differences, no? Separate company efficiencies, and other factors specific to one company or subgrouping within the M&A group that may legitimately play a role in determining the division of profits between enterprises in different tax jurisdictions. So, kasi ano ba yung essence? What is the core reasons or the prime reasons why we are studying this arm's length principle, we are studying this as compared to global formulary apportionment? It's, we deal with the collection of taxes, no? Yun yung pinaka-importante dito, no? Yun na yung tax mapunta kung saan siya dapat, no? And how much, no? The arm's length principle, in contrast, recognizes that an enterprise, associated enterprise, may be a separate profit or loss center with individual characteristics and economically may be earning a profit even when the rest of the M&A group is incurring a loss. So, pwede na yung isang grupo talagang kumikita, but while the other members of the group are losing. Global formulary apportionment does not have the flexibility to account properly for this possibility, no? So, by disregarding intra-group transactions for the purpose of computing consolidated profits, global formulary apportionment would raise questions about the relevance of imposing withholding taxes on cross-border payments between group members and would involve a rejection of a number of rules incorporated in bilateral tax treaties. So, yun yung mangyayari, no? Disregarding the intra-group transactions, which is very important sa arm's length principle. Diba? We have guidelines on intra-group services, intra-group, and cost contribution arrangement between the group. Unless global formulary apportionment includes every member of an M&A group, it must retain a separate entity rule for the interface between that part of the group subject to global formulary apportionment and the rest of the M&A group. Global formulary apportionment could not be used to value the transactions between the global formulary apportionment group and the rest of the M&A group, no? Thus, a clear disadvantage with global formulary apportionment is that it does not provide a complete solution to the allocation of profits of an M&A group unless global formulary apportionment is applied on the basis of the whole M&A group, no? So, parang kulang, hindi siya whole group. This exercise would be a serious undertaking for a single tax administration given the size and scale of operation of major M&A groups and the information that would be required. No? Sometimes an M&A group is bigger than a country. No? So, very sophisticated siya and difficult to handle. The M&A group would also be required in any event to maintain separate accounting for corporations that are not members of the M&A group for global formulary apportionment tax purposes, but that are still associated enterprises of one or more members of an M&A group. Sometimes kasi the M&A groups are such complicated na kasi yung may mga members siya na mayroon pa mga associated na companies na they should be taken as a whole, no? Kasi may relevance pa sila, may relation pa sila doon sa other members of the group, no? The M&A group would also be required in any event to maintain separate accounting for corporations that are not members of the M&A group for global formulary apportionment tax purposes, no? In fact, many domestic, commercial, and accountancy rules would still require the use of arm's length prices, no? Customs rules, so that irrespective of the tax provisions, a taxpayer would have to book properly every transaction at arm's length prices. No? So, arm's length prices pa rin yung binabalikan. No? So, rejection of non-arm's length methods for the foregoing reasons, OECD member countries reiterate their support for the consensus on the use of the arm's length principle. Kaya nga, sabi natin, the arm's length principle is the internationally accepted principle, no? Sa related party transactions, in taxing the related parties transactions. Guidance for applying the arm's length principle, and then identifying the financial, commercial, or financial relations. So, tapusin natin to kasi konti na lang. As stated in paragraph 1.6, a comparability analysis is at the heart of the application of the arm's length principle. Ano yung heart ng transfer pricing? The comparability analysis. Ano yung ginagawa sa comparability analysis? Compare the related party transactions with that of the independent transactions, because the independent transactions is the true pricing of goods and services compared to that of related party transactions, because in related party transactions there is an element of control, while sa independent, none. No? So, application of the arm's length principle is based on comparison of the conditions in a controlled transactions with the conditions that would have been made had the parties been independent and undertaking a comparable transaction under comparable circumstances. No? There are two key aspects in such analysis. First aspect, identify the commercial or financial relations between the associated enterprises and the conditions and economically relevant circumstances attaching to those relations. Kaya nga, sa comparability factors natin kasama yung economic conditions, no? So, in order that the controlled transactions is accurately delineated, no? So, the second aspect is to compare the conditions and the economically relevant circumstances of the controlled transaction as accurately delineated with the conditions and the economically relevant circumstances of the independent enterprises. No? So, yung section, chapter 1 natin provides guidance on identifying commercial and financial relations between associated enterprises. No? And on accurately delineating the controlled transactions. So, this first aspect of the analysis is distinct from the second aspect, no? Considering the pricing of the controlled transaction under the arm's length principle. No? The guidance on the second aspect of the analysis, chapters 2 and 3, no? So, the information about the controlled transaction determined under the guidance, especially for steps 2 and 3 of the typical process of a comparability analysis. Ito yung process ng comparability analysis, no, as found in these regulations. The typical process dito sa transfer pricing guidelines ng OECD, sa transfer pricing guidelines naman na ginawa ng sa Pilipinas, yung Revenue Regulations 2-2013 natin, there are only 3 steps, no? Kinlaster lang nila yung mga steps. Pero sa OECD, mas marami yung steps, no? So, the process then narrows to identify how its M&E within the M&A group operates and provides analysis of what its M&A does, no? Production company, ito yung functions, no? Identifies its commercial or financial relations with associated enterprises as expressed in transactions between them, no? So yung accurate delineation of the actual transactions or transactions between associated enterprises requires analysis of the economically relevant characteristic of the transactions. Kasi ang transfer pricing talaga is economic taxation. That's why it always deals with the economic conditions, the relevant economic circumstances, no? That's why itong nangyari na pandemic, this really has an impact on the taxable transactions natin. No? That's why yung Center for Tax Policy and Administration ng OECD are trying very much or hard to relate with the difficulties ng mga taxpayers. No? They're coming up with policies how to help the taxpayers. The application of the arm's length principle depends on determining the conditions that independent parties would have agreed in comparable transactions in comparable circumstances. No? So before making comparisons with uncontrolled transactions, it is therefore vital to identify the economically relevant characteristics of the commercial or financial relation as expressed in the controlled transactions. No? So ano yung mga economically relevant characteristics or comparability factors na kailan identify for commercial or financial relations, no? Between the associated enterprises to accurately delineate the actual transactions, no? Ito yung contractual terms of the transactions, no? Ito yung 5 comparability factors, no? So the functions performed by each of the parties to the transaction, taking into account assets used, risk assumed, including how these functions relate to the wider generation of value by the M&A group to which the parties belong, no? The circumstances surrounding the transaction and industry practices. So ito yun, kasama yan sa pag gumagawa tayo ng transfer pricing analysis, no? What are the accepted industry practices of the industry? The characteristic of property transferred or services provided, the economic circumstances of the parties and of the market in which the parties operate, and the business strategies pursued by the parties, no? Sa according to study, itong mga business strategies should only be temporary. Why? Kasi kung the business strategies makes the entity incur losses, then it should be temporary, no? Kasi kung i-continue niya yung business strategies, the danger of losing the business, no? Kasi always losing. The information about economically relevant characteristic of the actual transaction should be included as part of the local file as described in Chapter 5, in support of taxpayers' analysis of its transfer pricing. So, importante yung transfer pricing analysis in the study of transfer pricing. Economically relevant characteristic or comparability factors are used in two separate but related phases in transfer pricing analysis. No? The first phase relates to the process of accurately delineating the controlled transaction for the purpose of this chapter and involves establishing the characteristic of the transaction. So ano ba yung klase ng transaction? Saan mo yan makikita? Doon sa second comparability factors, yung functions, assets, and risks, no? Including its terms, the functions performed, assets used, risks assumed by the associated enterprises, the nature of the products transferred or services provided, no? And the circumstances of the associated enterprises in accordance with the categories set out in the previous paragraph. The extent to which any one of the characteristics categorized above is economically relevant in a particular transaction depends on the extent to which it would be taken into account by independent enterprises. So when evaluating the terms of the same transaction, were it to occur between them, no? Independent enterprises, when evaluating the terms of a potential transaction, will compare the transaction to the other options realistically available to them, and they will only enter into transaction if they see no alternative that offers a clearly more attractive opportunity to meet their commercial objectives. So this can be a benchmark, no? Kaya nga, we have to compare the independent party and the related parties. Kasi kagaya ng independent parties, hindi sila papasok sa isang transaction na alam nilang malulugi sila. In other words, independent enterprises would only enter into a transaction if it is not expected to make them worse off than their next best option. So the independent parties will always consider the best option, no? For the related parties, hindi mo makikita yan. Why? Because what is the next best option of the related entities when in fact it is only dealing with its related groups, no? So there is no such condition or situation na ma-encounter yung independent parties compared to that of the related parties, no? So magkaiba sila. For example, one enterprise is unlikely to accept a price offered for its product by independent commercial enterprises if it knows that other potential customers are willing to pay more than under similar conditions. So nakaka-bargain sila ng product, no? There is an offer na I will buy your product at 1 peso, pero mayroong ibang buyer na 150. So hindi sila na-attach. Unlike the related parties, hindi ganon ang mangyayari. Why? Kasi kahit nalugi yung isa, since related parties, ibibigay niya yung product. Why? Kasi it's the other party who will have a gain, no, or an advantage over the transactions. But considering that it is working within a group, no matter where the big profit will go, it doesn't matter because the same group, the same persons will benefit, no? Sa independent party, no situation like that, no? Independent enterprises will generally take into account economically relevant differences between the options realistically available to them, no? Such as difference in the level of risk, no? Mas risky ang independent compared dun sa related parties when valuing those options. Therefore, identifying the economically relevant characteristics of the transaction is essential in accurately delineating the controlled transactions and in revealing the range of characteristics taken into account by the parties to the transaction in reaching the conclusion that there is no clearly more attractive opportunity realistically available to meet their commercial objectives than the transaction adopted, no? Also, in making assessment, it may be necessary or useful to assess the transaction in the context of broader arrangement. Kailangan i-consider mo talaga lahat, no? Broader arrangement of transactions. Since assessment of the options realistically available to third parties is not necessarily limited to the single transaction, but may take into account broader arrangement of economically related transactions. So, the second phase in which economically relevant characteristics or comparability factors are used in transfer pricing analysis relates to the process, no, set out in chapter 3, making comparisons between controlled transactions and uncontrolled transactions to determine arm's length price for the controlled transaction. So, ano bang hinahanap? Why you control the arm's length price, no? Kasi especially na magkaiba yung price ng related party with that of the independent party. Kaya hanapin mo yung arm's length price. And usually, what is the arm's length price? It's the independent party price. Yun yung usually ang arm's length price, no? To make such comparison, taxpayers and tax administrations need first to have identified the economically relevant characteristics of the controlled transaction, no? So differences in economically relevant characteristics between controlled and uncontrolled arrangement need to be taken into account when establishing whether there is comparability between the situations being compared and what adjustment may be necessary to achieve comparability. Because after comparing and you know that there is a difference or there are differences, then you have to adjust in order to make the two transactions equal, no? Because you have to adjust with those factor that materially affects the similarities or differences, no, of the two transactions. So all methods that apply the arm's length principle can be tied to the concept that independent enterprises consider the options realistically available to them, and in comparing one option to another, they consider any differences between the options that would significantly affect their value, no? Example, before purchasing a product at a given price, independent enterprise normally would be expected to consider whether they could buy an equivalent product or otherwise comparable terms and conditions, but at a lower price from another party. So yun yung usual, no? Magka-canvas pa sila ng availability of a cheaper product. Why? Because ang consideration dyan is that you have to generate a bigger profit, no? So you have to look for opportunity to have a bigger profit. So how can you have a greater, bigger profit? By buying your inventories at a lower price, no? So hindi basta-basta bibili na kaagad ng inventory, kakanvas pa kung saan mas nakakamura, no? So therefore, the comparable uncontrolled price method compares a controlled transaction to similar uncontrolled transactions to provide a direct estimate of the price the parties would have agreed to had they resorted directly to a market alternative to the controlled transaction, no? Method becomes a less reliable substitute for arm's length transaction if not all characteristics of these uncontrolled transactions significantly affect the price charged between independent enterprises are comparable, no? So resale price and cost plus methods compare the gross profit margin. Ito na yung transfer pricing methods, no? Earned in the controlled transaction to gross profit margins. Kasi they are comparing the gross margin earned in similar uncontrolled transactions. The comparison provides estimate of the gross profit margin one of the parties could have earned had it performed the same functions for independent enterprises, and therefore provides an estimate of the payment that party would have demanded, no? Kasi meron tayong tinatawag na costing, no? And then we have to cost and then we have to estimate the markup in order that we will arrive at the profit that we wanted to get on the transactions. The other party would have been willing to pay at arm's length for performing those functions. Okay. So, tapusin na lang natin to, no? And then we will continue next time, no? So our next live streaming would be on Monday and Wednesday, no? At 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock. No? So other methods discussed in Chapter 2, Paragraph 3 are based on comparisons of net profit indicators. That's why sa study ng transfer pricing, meron tayong tinatawag na mga profit indicators and we compute the ratios, no? Between independent and associated enterprises as a means to estimate the profits that one or its of the associated enterprises could have earned had they dealt solely with independent enterprises. Therefore, the payment those enterprises would have demanded at arm's length to compensate them for using the resources in the controlled transaction. No? Kaya, sa arm's length principle, this is solely for purposes of paying taxes. No? Pero sa actual, so many strategies can be done by these related parties. Where there are differences between the situations being compared that could materially affect the comparison, comparability adjustment must be made where possible to improve the reliability of the comparison. Kasi pag hindi na-improve yung comparison, then you have to reject the comparable. Hindi sila comparable. No? You cannot compare the two transactions. So, anong gagawin mo? You have to look for another comparables when you are doing a transfer pricing analysis. Therefore, in no event can an adjusted industry average returns themselves establish arm's length prices. Hindi mo ma-arrive yung arm's length price pagka kulang ka ng comparables because you cannot do the comparability analysis. No? So, in a discussion of the relevance of these factors for application of particular pricing methods, we have that in the chapter 2. No? But for our study tonight, no, we will stop at this point, and then we will continue next time. We will continue with the contractual terms of the transactions. No? So, wala nang shout out?
Wala pa po. Wala na po nag-comment.
Wala na rin nag-comment? Wala na rin nanonood?
Apat.
Okay. So, with that, thank you very much for watching, and sa mga subscribers, sa mga YouTubers natin, thank you also for your support sa YouTube channel natin. Dito sa Basic Transfer Pricing Philippines, we promise to give you updates in transfer pricing, and we promise to give you also more discussions so that we can have thorough knowledge in transfer pricing that we can apply in our work, especially if we do transfer pricing analysis. So with that, I would like to say thank you and have a good night.